The grand ballroom of Chicago's Whitmore Hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers, every detail polished to perfection. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music weaving through the clinking of glasses and murmured conversations. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully among the tables, serving wine to Chicago's wealthiest patrons, gathered for an annual charity gala. Grace Williams balanced a tray of water glasses with steady hands, her dark curls tucked neatly beneath a black headband. At 21, she had worked countless nights like this, always smiling politely, always fading into the background. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. Table 12 was at the center of the room, where the most influential guests sat. Among them was Charles Bennett, the billionaire whose name adorned half the skyscrapers in downtown Chicago. To most people in the room, he wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of power and untouchable success. Grace approached quietly, the soft click of her shoes barely audible over the music. As she set a glass of water in front of Bennett, her eyes caught a small mark on the inside of his left wrist. It was faint, crescent-shaped, barely larger than a nickel. Her breath hitched before she could stop herself. "Hi, sir," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "My late father had the same birthmark." The words seemed to freeze the air. Bennett's silver fork stopped midair, his gaze snapping to her with a look that was neither anger nor confusion, just shock. Grace realized what she had said, but it was too late to take it back. Around them, laughter and conversation continued. The quartet played on, and the glasses still clinked, but at that table, time held still. Bennett slowly lowered his fork, his eyes drifting to the mark on his own wrist as if seeing it for the first time. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't meant to say anything, yet the sight of that birthmark had pulled the words from somewhere deep inside her, a place filled with questions she'd carried her whole life. "I'm sorry," she murmured quickly, taking a step back, her apron brushing the edge of the tablecloth. But Bennett didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on her, wide but unreadable. Grace gripped the water pitcher tightly and turned away, retreating toward the kitchen door. She could feel the stares from nearby tables, some curious, some judgmental, but she kept walking. Behind her, Bennett's shoulders had stiffened, his thumb unconsciously brushed across the familiar mark on his wrist. A name he hadn't spoken in 2 decades slammed into his mind. Anna Williams, the girl with paint-stained hands and a fire in her eyes. The girl he'd loved, then let go because he hadn't been brave enough to stay. For years, he had buried that part of his life under layers of power, wealth, and silence. But tonight, a stranger's quiet remark had cracked it open. Grace disappeared through the kitchen doors, her heart pounding. She hadn't been looking for anything, least of all this. Yet something about the way he looked at her made her wonder if she'd just spoken the truth out loud for the first time. Across the room, Charles Bennett remained frozen in his seat, his mind reeling as the gala carried on without him. Sometimes, it only takes one unguarded moment to unravel an entire lifetime of silence. If you believe every story deserves to be heard, please subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Charles barely touched his dinner after Grace disappeared into the kitchen. Conversations around him blurred into meaningless noise. The gala, once a carefully orchestrated event of power and appearances, now felt suffocating. Back in his penthouse that night, he stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the Chicago skyline glittering below. But his mind wasn't in Chicago. It was back in Charleston, South Carolina. Humid summers, magnolia trees swaying in the evening breeze, and the laughter of a young woman who had once turned his world upside down. Her name had been Anna Williams. Anna was a painter, a dreamer with calloused hands and unapologetic passion. She had a way of seeing beauty in everything: old buildings, tired faces, crooked smiles. Charles had met her one summer while working on a college internship for a development project. She had been hired to paint a mural for one of the company's community spaces. He had been captivated immediately by her warmth, her stubbornness, the streak of paint she always seemed to have on her cheek. They spent long evenings talking by the river, sharing stories about art, ambition, and the world they both hoped to change. But Charles had grown up in a family that prized image and legacy above all else. His father had built an empire on silence and compliance. When the family found out about Anna, about her skin color, her humble roots, they made their expectations brutally clear. "You are not to disgrace our name with this entanglement," his father had said, his voice cold and final. And Charles, young and terrified of losing everything he'd been told mattered, stayed quiet. He let Anna walk away. She never told him she was pregnant. He never asked. That silence became the foundation of his life, an unspoken choice buried under wealth and power. For 2 decades, he convinced himself it had been for the best. But Grace's words that night cracked open everything he had built around that lie. Meanwhile, Grace stood in the staff corridor of the hotel, numb to the reprimand spilling from her manager's lips. "Completely unprofessional," the woman scolded. "Do you have any idea who that was? You're lucky he didn't complain on the spot." Grace barely heard her. The words washed over her like static. Boundary, VIP experience, standards. None of it mattered. All she could think about was the look on Charles Bennett's face when she spoke, not anger, recognition. It was the kind of look you give a memory that refuses to die. Later that night, in the small apartment she shared with an elderly family friend, Grace sat on her bed and stared at the photo taped to her mirror. Her mother, Anna, was just 21 in the picture, cradling baby Grace in her arms, her eyes tired but proud. Grace reached into her nightstand drawer and pulled out a worn, yellowed envelope with no address. Inside was a letter her mother had written but never sent. Grace had memorized the words by heart. "If our daughter ever finds you, please be kind. Please be better than silence." Grace whispered to the air, her voice barely audible. "I think I found him, Mom." Across the city, Charles sat at his desk, hands trembling as he opened his laptop. With hesitant fingers, he typed Anna Williams Charleston into the search bar. A few records appeared, one of them an obituary dated 8 years ago. Anna Marie Williams, 1979 to 2015, survived by one daughter, Grace Williams. No father listed. His throat tightened as he clicked the link. The photograph hit him like a punch. Anna, older but still unmistakably her. The same eyes, the same slight tilt of the head. Charles stared at the screen for a long time, then closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his chest heavy with something he hadn't felt in decades: regret. Grace had grown up never knowing her father. Anna rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was always brief and vague. She said he had kind eyes, but a weak backbone. Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman Grace lived with, had once told her. Grace had lost her mother to cancer when she was just 13. Anna had fought hard to stay present, even when the treatments drained her strength. She had taken on extra shifts as a waitress at night, determined to provide for her daughter until the very end. After her passing, Grace moved in with Mrs. Carter, a longtime neighbor who became both guardian and confidant. Mrs. Carter had seen the letter Anna wrote but never mailed. "She didn't want you growing up hating a ghost," she had said softly, "and she sure didn't want you chasing one." Grace had never chased anyone, but she had always wondered. Back in his penthouse, Charles sat motionless in the leather chair, staring at the faint mark on his wrist. It was absurd, how such a small thing could carry so much weight. For years, he had buried Anna's memory under layers of business deals and corporate empires. But now, staring at her obituary, he realized how much of his life had been built on silence. She had been gone for 8 years. She had raised their daughter alone, and he had never known. Charles closed his eyes, a single question echoing in his mind. Why didn't you tell me? But deep down he knew the answer. Because she had tried, and he had been too much of a coward to listen. That night, Grace lay awake, her thoughts circling endlessly. She thought of her mother's sacrifices, of the nameless man who had always been a shadow in her life. She thought of the way Charles Bennett had looked at her, like someone seeing a ghost. For the first time, she dared to wonder if the man who owned half the city's skyline might also own a part of her story. And somewhere across Chicago, Charles sat in the dark, finally confronting the cost of the life he had chosen. Everything he had built suddenly felt hollow, because it had all been constructed on the silence of a man too afraid to love out loud. The next morning, Grace walked through the heavy glass doors of the Chicago Public Library. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that always made her feel grounded. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that she needed to see her mother's name somewhere, anywhere, connected to the man who might be her father. In the quiet corner of the archives, Grace scrolled through decades-old newspapers on a microfilm machine. Her fingers trembled as she turned the dial. And then, On a grainy page from the summer of 2001, she saw it. Bennett Development announces Riverside project. The photo was black and white, the image blurred with age. Charles Bennett stood smiling among a group of city officials. But what made Grace's breath catch was the woman at the edge of the frame. Easel behind her, paint-smeared hand raised mid-wave. Her mother. Beneath the photo was a single line. Local artist Anna Williams assists with mural concept. That was it. No mention of what happened to her after. No acknowledgement of her contribution. It was as if she had been erased from the story before it was ever written. Grace leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. For years, she had believed her father had simply disappeared. But now she wondered, what if her mother had been deliberately forgotten? That night, Grace opened her laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim room as her fingers hovered over the keys. She started typing, then deleted the words. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, she wrote, I met a man last night. He didn't recognize me, but I think he recognized something, a mark on his wrist and maybe something more. I don't want money. I don't want headlines. I want the truth. This isn't a story about inheritance, it's about identity. About a girl who grew up in silence and a man who may have built empires on forgetting her mother. If you're reading this, Mr. Bennett, I'm still here. And I have questions that won't stay buried anymore. She titled the post, The Girl with No Father and a Birthmark Full of Questions. She didn't hit publish, not yet. She saved it as a draft and closed the laptop. But 2 nights later, she pressed the button. Within hours, the post spread quietly through online communities. Forums for children of absent parents, groups for Black artists, think pieces on power and accountability. People resonated with her words. They shared their own stories of lost fathers, broken promises, and unanswered questions. Grace hadn't expected anyone to care. But suddenly, her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to countless others who had lived through the same kind of silence. Across the city, Charles Bennett sat in his office on the 38th floor, papers strewn across his mahogany desk. He had spent the day avoiding his reflection in the glossy windows. When his assistant forwarded him a link, he opened it absent-mindedly. But as he read the first line, his chest tightened. By the time he reached the end, his hands were trembling. Every word was a mirror he couldn't look away from. For decades, Charles had avoided thinking about Anna, about what he had given up to preserve his family's approval, about the daughter he hadn't known existed. But now, there was no avoiding it. For the first time in his life, Charles Bennett, master of control, builder of empires, felt powerless. The next morning, he made a call. This is Charles Bennett. I'd like to speak with Grace Williams, privately, at her convenience. When Grace saw the voicemail from an unknown number, her chest tightened. She didn't call back that day, or the next. Instead, she took the train across town to Mrs. Carter's small apartment, where the older woman was trimming her window plants. He reached out, Grace said quietly, standing in the doorway. Mrs. Carter didn't turn around. And what did you say? Nothing yet. That's still saying something. Grace stepped inside, dropped her bag near the couch, and sat down. Do you think he knew? She asked softly. All this time? I think some men don't ask questions because they're afraid of the answers, Mrs. Carter replied, and others because they already know. Grace stared out the window. A boy on a bike laughed as he rode past. Do I meet him? She asked finally. That depends, Mrs. Carter said, setting down her pruning shears. Are you looking for a father or just the truth? Grace didn't answer. She didn't know. 2 days later, Grace finally returned the call. The cafe was small and tucked into a quiet street on the city's south side, the kind of place her mother would have loved. Local paintings lined the wooden-paneled walls. Charles was already seated when Grace arrived, alone. No assistant, no briefcase, just a man in a dark coat with a porcelain cup of coffee untouched before him. He stood when he saw her. Grace, he said softly. Mr. Bennett. She sat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Charles said finally, clearing his throat. I didn't do it for you, Grace replied, her eyes steady. He nodded, accepting her words. I read your blog, all of it. Then you know why I'm here. You want answers? No, she said firmly. I deserve them. Charles's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. I didn't know about you, he said after a pause. Not until the other night. But when you spoke, When I saw you, I saw Anna in your face, and it shook me in a way I wasn't ready for." Grace blinked quickly, but didn't look away. "You say you didn't know," she said, her voice steady. "But did you ever wonder?" "Yes," Charles admitted. "In the early years, I did. After Anna left, I thought about it. I considered reaching out. But my life, my family—" He stopped himself. "That's not an excuse. I was a coward." "Yes," Grace whispered. "You were." He nodded slowly, the truth settling heavy between them. "I'll live with that for the rest of my life." The coffee between them had gone cold, untouched. "My mom, she painted you, you know," Grace said suddenly. "Even when she hated herself for it, every canvas was a memory you didn't earn." Charles's throat tightened. "She said you had kind eyes," Grace added softly. "I never believed her, not until now." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "I would give anything to undo what I failed to do back then. But I can't. All I can offer now is whatever truth, acknowledgement, or presence you'll allow me to give." Grace studied his face, every wrinkle, every silver strand of hair, the weight of years he carried. "I'm not here for your money or your name," she said quietly. "I don't want a house or a trust fund." "I believe you," he replied. "I just want to know—" Grace hesitated, her voice cracking slightly. "Did you love her? Did you love my mother?" Charles didn't look away. "Yes," he said simply. "More than I had words for back then. More than I had courage to admit." Grace's eyes welled, but she blinked the tears away. "And me?" she asked softly. "If you'd known, would you have wanted me?" Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, faded photograph. He set it gently on the table. It was Anna, barefoot by a river, visibly pregnant, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. "She sent this to me once," he said quietly. "I never opened the envelope, not until last week." Grace pressed her hand over her mouth, her chest tight. "I didn't want to know," Charles admitted, "because knowing would have made me accountable, and I was too weak to be accountable." He looked at her with eyes full of regret. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I am asking, will you let me try now?" Grace didn't answer immediately. The cafe felt smaller, the light more golden, like time itself was holding its breath. Finally, she said softly, "I don't hate you, but I don't know you, and I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to decide today," Charles said gently, "or tomorrow. I'll take whatever you offer." Grace nodded slowly, her heart torn but strangely lighter than before. For the first time in years, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like the start of a bridge. 3 days later, the Bennett Foundation held its annual winter press conference in the grand atrium of Bennett Tower. The air outside was sharp with January cold, the kind that cut through even the finest wool coats. Inside, journalists and cameras buzzed with expectation. Everyone assumed Charles Bennett would announce a new development project, another philanthropic donation, just another headline to cement his legacy. But as he stood behind the velvet curtain, Charles felt none of his usual composure. For the 5th time, he adjusted his tie. His assistant handed him the speech he had meticulously written and rewritten. He folded it once, then again, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't going to read it. "Grace isn't here," his assistant whispered, glancing at the front row. Charles nodded once. "That's all right. This isn't about who's watching." When he stepped out, the camera flashes were blinding. The crowd hushed as he walked to the podium, alone. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but softer than usual. "Thank you for being here today. I was supposed to talk to you about investment growth and community expansion, but instead, I'm going to talk about something else, something I should have said a long time ago." The room shifted uneasily. In 2001, I fell in love with a woman named Anna Williams. She was a painter, brilliant, stubborn, compassionate, and she was black. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Charles didn't flinch. At the time, I let fear guide my silence. My family, my reputation, my status, they all spoke louder than my heart. I walked away from her. I told myself it was for the best. But the truth is, I was a coward. Gasps spread quietly across the room. A camera shutter clicked loudly, breaking the stillness. I didn't know that when she left, she was pregnant. She didn't tell me. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't trust me to stay, and I don't blame her. But 21 years later, her daughter found me. She didn't come with a lawyer. She didn't come with anger. She came with a quiet voice and a single question I wasn't ready for. He lifted his hand briefly, showing the inside of his left wrist. "Hi, sir. My late father had the same birthmark." The room was silent now, every ear tuned to his words. "I don't tell you this for sympathy," Charles continued. "I tell you this because silence has a cost, because love is not something we should be afraid to speak, no matter how powerful we are, and because the absence of action can be as much a betrayal as a lie." He took a breath, scanning the crowd. "I failed 2 people. I can't change that, but I will spend the rest of my life honoring them, both of them. Not with money, not with headlines, but with truth." He stepped away from the podium. "No questions, no press release, just the truth," finally said aloud. Then he walked off stage. Grace sat on the worn couch in Mrs. Carter's living room, laptop open on her knees, streaming the press conference live. She didn't move when he said her mother's name. She didn't move when he called himself a coward. But when he lifted his wrist and repeated her words, she exhaled, long and shaky. Mrs. Carter, arms folded and dish towel draped over her shoulder, glanced at Grace. "He did it," she said softly. Grace's eyes stayed on the screen, her hands gripping the edges of the laptop. "He didn't hide behind lawyers or statements. He stood up." Grace nodded silently, because part of her had always believed that men like him stayed silent forever. And yet, he had spoken. A week later, Grace stepped off a train in Charleston, her mother's hometown. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, magnolia trees swaying gently as if whispering old secrets. Charles stood beside her, both hands wrapped around a bouquet of white camellias. He had offered to drive, but Grace wanted to walk. She wanted to feel the ache in her legs, to earn the weight of this moment. They walked past cobblestone streets and wooden porches, saying little. Charles looked as though he wanted to speak several times but didn't. When they reached Hillcrest Cemetery, Grace paused at the gate. "She used to bring me here on Sundays," she said quietly. "Not just to visit my grandmother. She'd sketch the trees, the angels. She said even cemeteries had stories worth telling." Charles swallowed hard. She always saw what others overlooked. "She saw you once," Grace murmured, "when you didn't know how to be seen." They followed the gravel path to a weathered headstone. The engraving was simple, but still clear. Anna Marie Williams, 1979-2015. She painted silence into color. Grace knelt, her fingers brushing over her mother's name. She didn't cry. Her grief had long settled into something quieter, less raw. Charles stepped forward and placed the bouquet at the base of the grave. He remained standing, his expression unreadable. Then, from the inside pocket of his coat, he pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I wasn't sure when I'd give this to you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I think this is the right place." Grace opened it slowly. Inside was a delicate silver locket, oval and worn smooth with time. She clicked it open. On one side was a photo of her mother at 20, laughing, eyes full of light. On the other side, a small pressed white camellia. "She gave this to me once," Charles said, his voice cracking slightly. "The night before she left. I didn't wear it. I didn't even open it again until last week." Grace traced the edge of the locket with her thumb. "She always loved giving people pieces of herself," she whispered. "Tiny ones. Like she was afraid to give too much." Charles looked down at the grave, his hands trembling. "She gave me more than I deserved, and far more than I ever acknowledged." They stood in silence, broken only by the rustle of wind through the magnolias. "She never wanted to be anyone's burden," Grace said finally. "Not even mine. When she got sick, she left voice notes on her phone just in case. I still have them. Sometimes I listen, just to hear her voice." Charles's eyes glistened. "I wish I could have been there for her. For both of you." "You weren't," Grace said gently. Not harsh, just honest. "But you're here now, and you're not hiding." He nodded slowly. "No, I'm not." Grace knelt again and set the locket beside the flowers. "I think she would have liked this," she said softly. "Not because it's perfect, but because it's real." The two of them stayed until the sun dipped low, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and shadow. Neither wanted to leave first. Eventually, the chill of evening crept in. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said quietly. Charles nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to, but I'm willing to see if you can be someone worth respecting. That would matter more than biology ever could." For the first time in decades, Charles Bennett felt something shift inside him. Not redemption, not yet, but the fragile start of hope. And Grace, though still uncertain, felt the weight she had carried for years begin to loosen. This wasn't forgiveness, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something that could grow. A year later, Grace stood backstage at a downtown art gallery, palms damp as she waited to be introduced. The banner above the stage read, "Legacy and Visibility, Stories Unforgotten." Her worn sketchbook rested under her arm, the same one her mother had given her on her 15th birthday. When the moderator called her name, Grace stepped out into the warm glow of the lights. The room fell silent as she approached the podium. She looked out at the crowd, heart pounding, then began. "I grew up with a blank space where a father's name should have been," she said. "For years, I thought silence was normal, that some stories weren't meant to be told. But silence isn't safety. It's a kind of theft. It robs people of their histories, their worth, their right to be seen." She paused, eyes sweeping the audience. "My mother, Anna Williams, was erased, not loudly, just gradually. And I lived in the echo of that. But I've learned that identity is more than a last name. It's the stories we claim, the voices we choose to honor, even when it's uncomfortable." Her voice softened. "Sometimes it takes 21 years and a single birthmark to begin telling the truth. And when we do, we not only find out who we are, we find out who we can become." The audience erupted in quiet, steady applause. Grace exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. At the back of the room, Charles Bennett stood silently, hands clasped in front of him. He hadn't announced his presence. This was her day, her voice. But as he watched her speak, pride welled up in him, a pride not in what he had done, but in who she had become despite everything he hadn't. When the event ended, Grace stepped outside into the cool evening air. Charles was waiting near the entrance, coat draped over one arm. "You spoke like someone who knows herself," he said softly. "I'm trying to," Grace replied with a faint smile. They walked side by side through quiet streets, neither rushing the silence between them. At a small bench beneath a street lamp, Grace stopped and reached into her bag. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a carefully wrapped package. Charles opened it slowly. Inside was a framed drawing, shaky lines, uneven proportions, but full of hope. It was a picture of a woman, a little girl, and a man, all holding hands. "I drew it when I was 10, Grace said. "It was the family I used to imagine." Charles swallowed hard, his fingers tracing the frame. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me be part of your truth." Grace looked at him steadily. "Just keep trying to be someone I can respect. That matters more than biology ever will." He nodded, voice thick. "I will, for as long as I have left." Grace adjusted the strap of her bag, then glanced at him. "Next year, same day, same magnolia tree." A slow smile spread across his face. "I'll be there," he said, "even if you're not." Thank you for watching Heart Touch Stories. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. We can't wait to see you in the next story of hope and kindness.